How's it going, Sketchy community? My name is Matt. I'm coming to you from Buffalo, New York in my studio, also doubling as the basement. Today I'm going to show you how I do some of my artwork. Today I'm going to be doing a scribble portrait in a couple steps. One being pencil drawing, two inking it, three, my favorite part, the scribbles, four, adding some watercolor, and five, adding some more color with Prismacolor pencils. So let's get into it. Thanks for joining me. So to get started, this is the picture I chose to work with today. It always feels a little bit like cheating when I do sunglasses, but there's some nice purples in here which should be kind of fun to paint. So this is the picture that I chose. First step I do, put it on the computer, and I'll take it over to Photoshop. I've cropped it down to give a 5x7. That's what I'll be working with today. I like to try to work a little smaller. I can get more details in there. So this is a super old version of Photoshop on an old garbage picked computer I have. And here's one of my bigger tricks. After I've cropped it and adjusted the colors, in these old versions of Photoshop, you can come and put a grid over your picture, which may be a little bit of cheating, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. So I've got my picture, I've got it cropped, I've got the grid over it, and the values adjusted. Now I'll show you what I work with on the paper. And so here's my working surface. The paper I'm using today is an Arches cold press. It's a little more expensive, but I really like the texture, and it really holds watercolor pretty well. It's a little more textured for ink than I like, but it really does well with the watercolor paints I use. I usually either buy them in blocks or in large sheets. This is from a large sheet that I ripped down. As I mentioned, I'm working in a 5x7 today. And as you can see on the paper here, I've already went ahead and drawn a grid. As I mentioned before, I used to think of this as kind of cheating. But over the years, a couple things have changed my mind. One, I don't remember which artist it was, but they mentioned to spend less time on the things you don't like and more on what you do like. And I really hate the first part of the sketch. I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and getting proportions right is incredibly important. If you don't get those right, I think everything after it really suffers. And so this really helps nail the proportions down and get what I'm starting with, the building block foundation, whatever you call it, really squared away. The second thing, once I started reading more about the old masters, they used optics. They used all sorts of tricks to get their first sketches down more than someone just eyeballing with a pen and paper. So I don't feel quite as bad about it anymore. So what I've done is I've created a 5x7 grid on this paper, just using a T-square. I've got marks going on every ½ inch and some tick marks on the 1/4 inches. And I always try to leave myself about a ½ inch or an inch of border around it, just in case I ever decide to mat this. I hate when paintings bump right up against the mat, and mats always tend to run a ½ inch smaller than the painting. So this is a 5x7. And whatever mat I chose would probably cut in a ½ inch of that. So I'm going to get started on the drawing now. This usually takes me 30 to 40 minutes maybe. Just the basic shapes, a little bit of the contours. I'll come back afterwards because this is kind of pretty boring but pretty straightforward. I'm not using anything more than a cheap mechanical pencil I got in my last business trip to Houston. And that's pretty much all I need to get started. So about a ½ hour in, I got my basic pencil sketch down. Fairly happy with it. The only tricky part sometimes is the hair, especially with detailed hair like this drawing. You can really spend a whole afternoon trying to get it perfect, but if you don't at least put some details in it, it's just going to look like a flat mess. So I try to go halfway in between, a little bit of detail, some ideas of where I want darker lines, and leave the rest blank. So my next step now, I'm going to just ink this pretty much exactly over the pencils I have. Nothing more yet in this step. My favorite are these microns. I use a 1, 3, and 5. I use the 1 for most of the face and some of the finer features, 3 for around that, and then maybe 5 for some of the darker spots in the hair. This is maybe a 15-minute process. It's kind of slow to get it exactly right. So I'll leave here, go pour myself another glass of whiskey, and I'll be back once this is done. So that was maybe another ½ hour of ink work. Just used my microns, like I said before. I traced over all of the pencil marks. Probably one step I forgot to mention is that occasionally on hair like this, I'll take a thicker marker. This is a fine tip, and I'll just add a little bit more dark. I think when you're working with hair like this, it's really important not to have all of line weight and to have some blacks in there and some lighter blacks, and it just gives it a little more dimension to it. So I think this is pretty much all of the solid ink I'm going to do for now. The next step, my favorite step, will be to add some squiggles to really highlight all the different contrasts in the picture. So I'm going to take my setup and go clamp it to a desk that's a little more sturdy so you can see how I actually do that. Alright, I got my setup change. I got the number one ingredient, a nice big glass of whiskey, to loosen your inhibitions about this. I'm going to start the squiggles now. I usually take a 005 micron to start. And basically all I'm trying to do is just start very light, not think about what I'm doing, and just work in darker areas first. And the goal really is just trying to darken the darker areas. So start with some shadows in the hair. Usually start with the darkest of the darks first. Again, not really caring what the exact shapes are, just trying to affect the value here. Hoping that the end goal is going to be something I like. Folds in the fabric. Again, you want this to be loose. You can do a couple big ones just to highlight where some of the changes. These changes in the face can always be a little hard. You don't want to get too dark, but you do want to capture that shadow under the chin. And also still maintain some of those contours of the collarbone. You can add some bigger shapes just to highlight some of the face structure. And always not too much in the lips. Try to remember where the light is coming from. In the hair, we don't really care if we cross over some of these lines as long as you let the line show through, which is why I use a skinnier micron to start with. Again, we're just trying to add value here, not so much about what the lines actually look like. Just try not to overthink this, just look at the picture and let the hand free flow. I try also never to really lift my pen off the paper. Helps give a more continuous. Glasses can be a little darker. When there is a spot that you want to darken a little bit more, I'll just keep squiggling but keep my pen over the exact same spot. You can also reinforce some of the hairlines as well, just following the lines that you already have. The spot under the chin is probably the darkest. I want to stay there the most. On the forehead, not as much. I'll try to stay off of that. think this area still needs to be a little darker. Right up in here. Can fill in a little bit of the negative space also with some lines. Helps make a little bit of movement. The glass is just a little darker, so I'll just can touch up a little areas too if you feel need to be it's a little darker, like lips. Again, I don't want the hair all to be the same value, so I'll just try to make sure that there's some pockets of dark and some parts that are a lot lighter. Try to just give it a little bit of dimension. Again, just staying loose. You need to stop and take another drink of whiskey to keep loose. Be my guest. And be a little bit more movement in the hair, some lighter lines just to even everything out. Again, trying never to lift my pen off the paper. That looks pretty good for now. Sometimes what I'll do, if there's areas that need to be a little bit darker, I'll just bump up the micron a little bit fatter. Just to maybe go over some areas that I think need a little bit more. Same technique, same idea. Just trying to add a little more ink to the paper. Remember, the watercolor will cover some of this, so you can go a little darker than you normally think you'd want to, because some of this will be covered up. I have a tendency in the past, sometimes I can overwork these a little bit, and I definitely don't want to do that, because you can just make a mess. Maybe just some of these pieces of hair evened out a little too much with the squiggles, so I'll just try to make some of them pop a little bit more so you can still notice them. Again, you don't want these all the same color. As long as you stay loose, there's really no way to screw this up. I think that's pretty good right there. So what I'm going to do now, finish up with the pens. I'm going to erase all my pencil marks, and then I'm going to tape it off and come back and do some watercolor. Okay, so I got all of my pencil marks erased. I've got my painting taped off, and I'm going to hit it now with the watercolor. My weapon of choice is Winsor Newton. They're pretty decent, a little bit expensive, but a little bit goes a long way. I really like these black velvet brushes. These are what I use. This is probably another half-hour process, so I'll just show you a little bit at the beginning and then come back when I'm done. I know there's a lot of different ways to start watercolor. I don't know. I'm still pretty novice, and my color scheme's not great. I don't know the names of all these colors. and I never know whether to start with what shade, but I tend to work in the primaries. I usually start with yellows, then I work into some reds, and then finish it off with blues for the shadows. So I don't like to wet anything before I start, so I usually start with the skin tones, something in the yellow, just to give me a base that I can layer and build up off of. First layer is usually pretty light, just trying to nail some of those yellows in the skin tones and maybe just come back a little darker in some of the spots. But again, not trying to lay down too much color to start with. Maybe a little bit of reds in here to start with too, but mostly yellows, a little bit of orange, and some skin tones. I like to leave a lot of white paper showing through, so I'll put a little bit down and then come back through with a wet brush just to spread it out. And again, sometimes I'll try to stay within the ink circles that I've already drawn. Again, areas like this will just be really, really light. So that's probably what I would do right there for my first layer, and I'll have, you know, maybe 20 different layers on top of this. So I won't show you all those and bore you with them, but I'll show you the one other secret weapon I have. I used to use a hair dryer until that broke, and so now I stole my wife's, I don't know, I guess it's an embossing gun or whatever. It does the same job. So this saves me a lot of time because I usually only have a half hour at night to paint once the kids are in bed before I fall asleep. So that'll set the layer. I can start on the next one and I don't have to worry about the wet getting into the wet. And I'll just repeat this process 15-20 more times until I'm done. So we'll come back after that. Alright, so I finished up the watercolor. Everything's all dried. Last and final step, I'm going to hit it with some Prismacolor color pencils. Just going to hit the highlights. Again, this is a little bit of a long step. It's just kind of touch and feel. Add a little more color, make it a little more pop than it is now. We'll come back and finish it up. Alright, I finished up with the colored pencils. I'm pretty happy with this now. Last and final step, my favorite step, removing the tape and seeing how it all looks. Hopefully nothing bled. Spill the whiskey carefully. And there we go. My sketchy portrait with some scribbles for the day. Thanks for joining me.